By all means, Pele. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. In a world sweating, at least in the northern hemisphere, from out of control heat waves and much more out of control wars. We're in crisis. From Iran to Ukraine, we have Canada and Australia ganging up in the United States against the United States with Europe. Why? Because we are going out of control in America? No, because they want to go more out of control than we are. And they don't even have the military muscle to do so. So the world's going mad. Everything's upside down and downside out. And therefore, we want to bring you another dose of sanity and realism from a friend of ours who embodies those far too overlooked and forgotten and despised qualities. We are very glad and privileged and pleased to have back our old friend, Cameron Macgregor. And Cam right now is in New York City. He's been traveling a great deal in recent months. And that's not small because Pele and I have traveled a great deal in our careers, but less so in recent years, me especially. That's one of the
Yeah.
things that goes with the ineptitude, I hope not the ineptitude, but certainly the slowing down, the physical slowing down of old age. And there's no substitute, I always found, for being in places, talking to people, listening to them, getting the feel of them, and going back repeatedly and see how things are changing. And that's what we want to learn from you, Cam. How is especially you were in Turkey in recent months, the Middle East is changing like a kaleidoscope. What are we missing? What do we need to watch there?
Well, let me just, as a preamble, make a statement regarding change itself, because what is truly remarkable, and I happen to be in New York City at the moment, which I regard as one of the citadels of power in the old world, certainly New York City and Washington, D.C. They are situated not by location, but by time, I would submit. And that is to say, that they live in the world of the 1990s. And perhaps you could argue
Yes.
they live in the world before the 90s as well. Maybe they live in just after World War II, the sort of post World War II world. And I'll elaborate on exactly what I mean. But they certainly do not live in the world today as it's unfolding before our eyes. And what specifically I mean about that is that if you consider for a moment what is happening in Ukraine, which appears to be an escalation. It appears to be a change in mindset in the Kremlin regarding Europe and the United States. If you look a bit farther afield towards the Middle East, I think there's a similar shift in viewpoint across the region regarding the presence of U.S. military forces. This is not solely about Iran. I think there's a broader awakening in the Arab Street. I think the Turks feel very similarly that increasingly beneath the elites, the view is that American presence in the Middle East is becoming intolerable. And obviously, that presence is tied at the hip with Israel. And I think the Russians increasingly feel the same thing about NATO inside of Europe. And then if you look even farther east, I think the Chinese, who tend towards isolationism and are not terribly keen on getting involved in these affairs beyond their sphere of influence, beyond East Asia, they're increasingly concerned as well that the United States is becoming a rogue state that's destabilizing the global economy, that's disrupting energy supply chains. So, in each of these areas, there is concern. There is a sense that the world is headed towards some kind of conflict. However, what's the view from Wall Street? Well, Wall Street believes that what's happening in the Gulf is just another Middle Eastern war. That's all it is.
Exactly.
And they price the markets accordingly. Oil prices have not risen significantly over the last month or so. In fact, they've come down. The sense is that, however tenuous this memorandum of understanding is, and obviously, I think that memorandum was always a fiction, but if ever it was believed, it is no longer, certainly by regional actors. But on Wall Street, whatever else may be going on, Trump will taco. That is to say, Trump always chickens out, and that the Straits of Hormuz will reopen in some meaningful sense. I don't think that that's going on at all, but that's what Wall Street thinks. What about Washington, D.C.? Washington, D.C. even more dangerously believes that China is weak, that their economy is in free fall, that their lack of action demonstrates a kind of passivity and weakness that I think is the exact opposite. I think it's the complete inversion of that statement. And regarding Iran, they think Iran is vulnerable, that there's some kind of split in leadership domestically, that the United States needs to quote unquote finish the job. And I fear, and I know that this is astounding to both of you, but I also think that inside DC, the sense is that the Russians are losing the war in Ukraine, a
Yeah,
statement for which there is absolutely no evidence, as far as I
exactly.
can tell, but that is their view. And so
Yes,
all of this explains, I think, unfortunately, what the United States is doing, which is to double down in each of these spheres on U.S. empire, whatever else it may be. And by doing so, they're going to guarantee its destruction. That's where we are.
Wow. Um, do you
really?
think Trump is aware? I mean, the biggest fear is that the Europeans think that they've won the game of persuasion that ended up with the conference of the NATO meeting in Ankara, and that they spent a lot of time and energy and money to create this basically a deception operation aimed at one man, Donald Trump, and his administration to persuade them that Ukraine was winning. And if they felt that they've won that battle of that they can drag step two will be drag America into war or have they got America's back. And of course, we know that alliances are transmission belts for war, and that these smaller countries, or Britain, which is, I mean, just as intensely Russophobic as it ever was, uh, has promised to build or send numerous drones and medium distance missiles into Ukraine for firing against Russia. And they think that they're winning the war in Crimea. Crimea has been a British obsession since 1953 or something. And that sort of mood music is enticing Trump with perhaps because he wants to have us now that if he's losing Iran, maybe he'll win on Ukraine, and that'll serve him well in the midterms. Um, they will be persuaded about that. And what worries me is if they do the enormous amount of stuff I'm reading, the message that comes out there is that if the West starts to fire more missiles into Russia, all the bets are off, and we might have a World War III. Are the Americans aware of that? Because I mean, Trump seems to have gone backwards in his awareness because, he was excoriating Biden for allowing ATACMS to be sent into Russia just after he was lost the election in November 2024, when Trump was going to come in 6 weeks later or whatever, and Russia responded with an Oreshnik, and that could be the next stage. And now Trump seems to have, we don't know quite where he stands on that. Where do we stand on that?
Okay, well, I know Martin likes Shakespeare, and I do as well. So I think a good way to summarize Trump and his tweets is to quote Macbeth. It's messaging full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. What you have to pay keen attention to are the actions. And going a step further, I think in this regard, we need to quote the great Marty Seif, and he said recently in an excellent piece called Tail Wags Dog, he said the following: global superpowers and great continent spanning empires are brought into needless total conflict and utter mutually assured destruction by states. Now, the question is, what state? Because the assumption governing a lot of political analysis over the last, I guess, 10 years when trying to understand Donald Trump has been that it's primarily the Israelis that he is beholden to. And I think that there's ample evidence to support that. However, what is missed gets back to what I said just a moment ago. What do people in Washington, D.C. think? What do they think? What is their point of
Yes.
view? That is where you must start, because you have to remember that while we have these parties called the Republicans and the Democrats, the fact of the matter is that if you consider the Georgetown Foreign Service School, the Fletcher School, the Harvard Kennedy School, the K Street lobbyists, all of the various think tanks inside DC that are advising the president, that are staffing his government, they're essentially guiding our policy. And for them, I can summarize everything that has happened in the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world over the last several decades, and that is on a ticket arguing that he was going to wind down the conflict in Ukraine. Maybe he intended to do so, maybe he did not. But his inner council never intended on that whatsoever. The Republicans and the Democrats never concurred with that whatsoever. And so you had a figurehead of sorts who maybe had instincts that were congruent with de-escalation, but the machinery of government was always going to subvert that. And so if you look at the folks around the president, Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary, Jared Kushner, who occupies an unofficial position, but continues to carry immense influence with the president. If you considered Eldridge Colby, who you just mentioned before we started the show, and their ilk, you get to the same kind of framework of analysis, and that is that Russia must be deterred, that NATO must be shored up, it must be strengthened. The United States cannot abandon the Europeans, that we have to denuclearize and ultimately regime change Iran, which, by the way, is what that conflict is all about. It is not control of the Straits of Hormuz. Exactly. It is not about a tit for tat. It is about the utter destruction of Iran. And by the way, that's what the war in Ukraine is about vis-a-vis Russia as well. Yes. What's troubling about all of this, gentlemen, is not simply that the cohort inside DC is more emboldened, more committed to those objectives than ever before, as evidenced by doubling down on these conflicts, by sending more drone technology or Patriot battery, making more hawkish statements verbally. But it's also that I think the Russians, the Iranians, and certainly the Chinese, they've been late to the game in figuring this out. They maintain, and this is what's ironic about all of it, that the United States is a rational regime. But people inside the Beltway believe that China, that Russia, that Iran are irrational actors that must be destroyed, period. And therefore, the pretext for the continuation of this conflict remains, regardless of what the president of the United States says. So I hope that answers your question, but I would go one step further and say the following. There is this gambit being advanced, that it continues to be advanced, that the president is going to ebb and flow with the midterm elections. Look, the midterm elections are much ado about nothing. And the reason for that is because there is no organized, scalable political movement in the United States that opposes any of these conflicts. I say again, there is no scalable political organization in the United States that opposes these conflicts. Notice I said organization. Yes, the public doesn't want an escalation in Ukraine. It doesn't want a continuation of the war in the Middle East whatsoever. But there is no organized opposition. And so you're stuck with two legacy parties, much as you have in Great Britain, the Tories and Labour, who will conspire together, if necessary, to do whatever is possible to maintain a hawkish foreign policy, whatever the cost. And so here we are, and Donald Trump, I think, has been seemingly unable. Maybe it's a lack of executive capacity. Certainly, I think that's part of it. He was a man who never really understood the machinery of government. Part of it is who staffed his government. To be sure, you can't get a position of authority inside of the White House Security Council unless you bend the knee to the neocons or their ilk, okay? But more than anything, I think, and this is the answer to your question, Pele, is that no, people in DC and in New York City do not understand the precarity of the situation in the world today. They don't understand how dangerous the situation is in Ukraine. They do not understand how utterly devastating this conflict in the Middle East is, not just to the region, but to the global energy complex and ultimately to the pocketbooks of Americans. They don't understand that. And because of that, the recklessness continues.
Mm-hmm. Martin?
If I may chime in here, usually when one jumps in, it's to say, oh, I disagree with this or this, that, or the other. Here, it's quite the opposite, as you both know, and we've talked about this before, Cam. What I find terrifying is I have not a word of disagreement with your analysis. I, I don't believe I've ever heard anyone say it better. And you focused on the key issue. And I've done it very often myself. We focus on the Ukrainian junta or the tiny, ridiculous, ghastly little Nazi worshipping elites in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, who are also a hugely disproportionate influence in Canada, bizarrely enough. We focus on them. We focus on Mr. Netanyahu, who certainly wants a state of continual war. But what you are pointing out is there is something much more profound and deeper and settler. And as you know, I was in Washington, covered Washington, traveled widely in the world, but was in Washington for 36 years continually, still very much connected to people and institutions and monitoring organizations there. And it's exactly as you say. And I've even seen this change. When I came to Washington in the mid 1980s, it was still the Cold War. And Reagan was regarded as a super hawk with his people relative to the people who had gone before, because he thought correctly the Cold War could be won, though actually it was the Russians. It wasn't America who won the Cold War. It was the Russians who tried to win the Cold War for themselves because they themselves were still not remotely understood in America, as you well know, Cam. See, it's a crucial point. But then nobody took the neocons seriously then. They were there. They had serious money behind them. They had the Israel lobby behind them. But they were still regarded as wild lunatics not to be taken seriously. But not only did they have money and relentless energy on their side and the energy and commitment of madness, but also when the Cold War ended, it was even more than 1945, a sense of empowerment in America. A new generation, the neocon generation, took over. And as you say, they're still in the 1990s. They've never moved beyond it. And the 1990s, even at the time, was never what they thought it was. It wasn't. I worked for the late, great Arno de Borgrau through the 1990s. And he had this strange gift. He had intellectual power, but it wasn't that. It was something else. Arno had flashes of sense of seeing the way the world would go, whether it was anything from artificial intelligence to transhumanism, to the rise of China, to the conflict over border security and the collapse of border security and society in the United States. He saw these things 5 to 15 years before anybody else did. And as a result, he was always laughed at as a joke for doing so. And often he came up with things I thought were ridiculous. And 10 and 20 years later, I found the world had caught up with what Arno had seen. So now when you speak, I see exactly the same understanding. These people, like the late unlamented Senator Lindsey Graham, jet around the world to see their friends, to see their infernal Zelenskys and their infernal Netanyahus, and to seek to destroy Russia and seek to destroy Iran. And they haven't a clue where they are or who they're speaking to, what the reality of situations are. There was a photograph a friend of mine, Monty Quazell, sent me recently, and I really should send it to you and send it to other people because it's hugely revealing. It's a selfie that Senator Lindsey Graham took just in the last week of his life with his dear friend, Volodymyr Zelensky. And they're standing together at a drone factory, happy at the work that's being done to bring World War III ever closer by building drones in Ukraine to kill more Russians. And there is a smug, sinister, self-satisfied smile on Zelensky's face. But Graham's body language is much more interesting. Here is a 70-year-old man who has been a United States Senator for 23 years, and he looks like a prom boy on his first date. And he's giving a thumbs up. Like this. He gives a thumbs up. Not to signify, I mean, I've done that on our show as shorthand when I don't want to interrupt you or Pele or saying wise things that I agree with. But this is the United States standing, provoking world war with destruction threat against the United States itself, as well as against all of Europe. And the idiotic asshole is giving a thumbs up. Hey, isn't this great? Look, I'm with my friend. That's the caliber of people we're dealing with in Washington. And they're stuck in that. And unfortunately, I have not heard anyone put it as clearly as you have just put it. What is needed in Washington is a generational change completely in both parties across the board. Nothing else can save the Republic. And I don't think the Republic is going to be saved. I really do not. I'm very pessimistic and I want the Republic to be saved. But
Well,
uh,
in its current
please go ahead.
form,
Do you see any possible way in the political sphere ahead to break this frozen attitude?
I do. Look, I
Oh,
think it
go
was
ahead, please.
I think it was Ayn Rand who said, "You can deny reality. Reality.
Very good.
It is in such a moment that we find ourselves, and this is, I think, the consequence. It has allowed this distortion field to persist longer than it otherwise might. But
Oh, yeah.
let's make no mistake, if you consider the internal organs of the Western world, they are enfeebled, that they are sickly, they're in trouble. And in that sense, I would say that the problem is the solution, but that's where these conflicts resolve. There's a great book that was written years ago. I'm sure that Marty, you're familiar with it. It's called "Every War Must End" by Freddie Clay. And
No.
in that
Oh,
book,
okay, of course.
yes, he defines a strategy as a plan to end a conflict. And right now, what we've just discussed essentially are the contours of conflicts perpetuating themselves. But how do they end? I think what the Iranians have concluded is that there will be no end to this regional war in the Middle East, and that's what it is, until the United States armed forces have been summarily removed from the region, number one. And number two, that the Israeli state has been neutralized. And that tells you everything you need to know about the direction of travel for this conflict. Until that mission statement, until that reality has been accomplished or realized, this conflict is just going to continue and continue and continue. And if you pay keen attention to the details, so for example, in Israel Hayom magazine, I want to say 2 months ago, there was an article published about David Barnea's Mossad, and essentially influence warfare, an influence operation, which was designed to, via color revolution, using social media and the like, a comprehensive root and branch strategy to undermine and destroy the Iranian regime. That, I think, we knew about. But what was so telling about this particular article is that, according to various folks inside of Mossad, the war in Iran, or the war against Iran, was never over. Maybe there was a temporary lull, but ultimately, what we're experiencing is just the lead up to some broader escalation in which the United States would more directly come into the conflict, perhaps with boots on the ground, who knows? But I think that that's absolutely the case. However, the reality of the situation is that Iran has the military high ground in this conflict. This is not a war that's being waged via asymmetry. You're hearing a lot of that, I think, in the mainstream. And take it from me as a former naval officer, I'm here to tell you that what in 21st century armed forces, which is what the Iranians have, it goes deeper than simply deploying masses of drones or precision strike. It's having an industry that's tailored to reposition, dynamically changing, innovating on these various 21st century so that they can overcome a 21st century or armed force, which is what we have in the U.S. military. The Navy of today is a fundamentally 20th century force. It is not capable of winning this war, which is why we have lost the Straits of Hormuz. Okay. Furthermore, we don't have the procurement system. We don't have the defense industrial complex to rapidly change course and build the kind of 21st century platforms that we need to prevail. And that goes doubly so in Ukraine as well. Yes, we can provide the Ukrainian regime, I should say the fading Ukrainian regime, with drones, but that's about all we can do. So what I think the Russians, like the Iranians, have concluded is that the only way to end the conflict there is to fundamentally neutralize/destroy the Zelensky regime. There is no other way to end the conflict. And I do think that represents a permutation in the conflict because at the outset, I think the Russians were trying to get the contours of a broader peace agreement through negotiations. That's over.
Definitely.
We have exited that window. So if
Exactly.
you accept the premise of what I'm saying, that the end game means regime change in Ukraine, in Kiev, regime change inside of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and the mass exodus of U.S. forces, that means that this conflict is not over yet, that we're actually now going into the main thrust of the storm. However, there are also consequences domestically for the West. And that is to
Yes.
say, we're going to experience, and I think we're in the early stages of a very severe recession. That recession is layered on top of a cost of living crisis that we've got. You mentioned last time we were on the show that in the UK, they're paying the highest energy costs across Europe. Well, that's not peculiar to the UK. Deindustrialization is a very real problem across that continent, and they're not easily going to be able to adjust or suppress the inflationary pressures because of this war, which is only going to get worse. That's one. Second is that you're seeing bond yields rise everywhere in the Western world. This is happening in UK gilts. It's happening in France. It's happening in Germany. And yes, it's happening in the United States as well. In fact, the 30-year Treasury in America is now above 5%. The 10-year Treasury, which is the benchmark for mortgages and all manner of lending in the U.S. economy, well, that's almost at 5%. These are warning signs that something disastrous is imminent. And I think it's too late. It's too late to pull up because of everything that we just agreed upon a moment ago, namely that the pretext for a widening of the war, it's there. And there is no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you're going to see de-escalation. So the long and short of it is as follows. The end game is regime change, as I described, but it also means a kind of regime change in the Western world. And that will probably bring down governments. It will probably mean that in the UK, you're going to cycle through a few more prime ministers before you get a parliamentary reset. And I think you're going to see similar things in the United States when the public at large plunges into this acute, shocking, recessionary crisis that will almost certainly be fiscal in nature as well. I mean, the U.S. government, as we know, sort of leers from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. I mean, the government is shut down any given month because we're running out of money. And at the core of power, as we said, the elites, they don't care. They don't seem to perceive any real threat. And that's the giveaway that something disastrous is just over the horizon, perhaps before the end of the year.
Wow.
If I may just chime in here again, full agreement with you, of course. And I have to cite in here, I actually predicted this. I published a book. I had to publish it myself. I was turned down by 140 publishers for it. Get it on Kindle of Amazon. It's called Gathering Storm. My wife insisted on the title. I didn't want the title because I am not an admirer of Winston Churchill. I was very much when I was young, but he uses that title for the first and best volume of his World War II memoirs. And I said, look, I can't use a title that's already world famous. And Debbie said to me, but you are talking about a gathering storm. You have to call it what it is. And what the book is, and it's called Gathering Storm by Martin Asif, Amazon Kindle. And I predicted in 2015 that by 2028, the United States would be in one of the two greatest cyclical crises in its history. A combination of the US Civil War on the one hand, and of World War II and the Great Depression on the other. But because of the scale of our country now, the size of our population, the advancement of our technology, and most of all, the existence of thermonuclear weapons around the world, the dangers are infinitely greater than they even were in 1860-61, or than they were in 1933, or in 1939 to 1941. And I've just watched it remorselessly come about and develop since then. Gathering Storm, published in 2015. But this is what you have just diagnosed, Cam. You're saying the storm is here.
Well, the good news is And I'll be brief because I know Pele wants to ask
No,
another question and chime in. But the good news here is that, contrary to what you hear in DC, New York City, I think in London too,
Mm.
Iran, China, Russia, and I would say the global South in general are actually quite rational, and they
I
do
agree.
not want a world war.
Mm.
And yes, they may have to regime change
Mm.
these key states in order to bring these conflicts to an end. But I think they have the capacity to do so,
Mm.
and capacity to sustain these war efforts much longer, not just
No,
because
we
of the
don't.
internals, but we just don't have the military power whatsoever. And I know the Russians are very upset. They're very concerned about the bellicosity coming out of Brussels and the various, I call them sort of the triumvirate of the idiots, that being Merz, formerly Stammer, right? Now we've got
Burnham.
Andy Burnham, and of course Macron. But the reality is their words are hollow.
Mm.
Europe is in no position to fight major wars. They're completely deindustrialized.
Mm.
And so I do think the Russians should pause a bit
Yeah,
on that. But the Russians do not have any interest in invading Europe, as
I
both of
know.
you know. That is a boogeyman for which there's no evidence. Iran, increasingly in the Middle East, I think represents the broader Islamic world, not simply the axis of resistance, but the Arab street. And as you
Yes.
mentioned earlier, when I was in Turkey, the hostility for Israel and by extension the United States was palpable
Mm.
in Istanbul in particular.
Mm.
That's not necessarily reflected by Erdogan and the government, but it's very real
Mm.
in the streets of Turkey,
Mm.
who
Yes.
do not side with the United States and presumably NATO in that
Yeah.
conflict either. And then, of course, if you look farther afield, arguably the most responsible actor on the global stage today has been the Chinese,
Mm.
who over the last 2 months alone have thwarted a global energy crisis by pulling demand off the market so that they
Yes.
could keep the prices of oil down
Mm.
and ultimately keep
I'm afraid we're
that's
going to
not
wind up, gentlemen. I mean, talking about regime change, I mean, there was a murder of a British politician a few days ago, and that could be a way to steer the Reform Party, a kind of warning from British security state or something. Um, Incredibly interesting tour de force and tour d'horizon there from you, Cam. And I hope that Washington listens. I mean, what you're like a Cassandra. You're painting a picture that's totally at odds with the world as seen by the Washington bubble.